crisp days of autumn in the countryside. I'd spent all week prepping bags, packing snacks, and making sure my husband, Mark, felt supported as he navigated his family's expectations. We were a team, or so I believed. But as we pulled into the gravel driveway of that sprawling, pristine farmhouse, I felt a familiar, cold prickle at the back of my neck. My sister-in-law, Elena, was standing on the porch, holding a flute of champagne as if she were posing for a magazine cover. She was a woman of rigid aesthetics. Everything in her life was curated, color-coordinated, and, in my experience, emotionally sterile. She didn't smile when we climbed out of the car. She simply scanned us, her gaze lingering on Leo's muddy sneakers with a look of profound distaste. I forced a polite, tight-lipped grin and reached into the car to unbuckle Leo, who was already squirming with excitement to see his cousins. The afternoon started with the usual pleasantries, masked by the clink of silverware and the forced laughter of family obligation. But within an hour, the tension in the room began to thicken, suffocating and sharp. Elena followed me into the kitchen while I was getting Leo a glass of water. She leaned against the marble island, swirling the remnants of her drink, and watched me with those predatory, glassy eyes. She started with a comment about my lax parenting style, something about how she didn't believe in letting children roam freely without structured schedules. I brushed it off, trying to be the bigger person for Mark's sake. But then, she took a sip of her drink and looked over at Leo, who was happily stacking wooden blocks in the living room. "You know," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of chilling, feigned concern, "I feel for you. It's hard to watch him struggle to communicate, but I suppose some children just aren't meant to be bright. He's a bit dull, isn't he? Like a blank page that was never written on." My hand froze around the glass. The air in the kitchen vanished. I turned to look at her, my pulse hammering against my temples. But before I could process the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of her words, I heard a sharp, sudden crash from the living room, followed by Leo's high-pitched wail. I didn't think, I just moved. I sprinted into the living room, my heart constricting as I saw Leo sprawled on the hardwood floor, surrounded by a pile of shattered antique porcelain, a vase that had clearly been a centerpiece. He was clutching his hand, blood welling up from a nasty scrape on his palm, his face contorted in pure, bewildered terror. Elena's own children were standing a few feet away, their faces blank, watching him with a detached curiosity that felt more frightening than the accident itself. Before I could even reach him, Elena swept into the room, her silhouette blocking the sunlight from the bay windows. She didn't look at Leo. She looked at the shards of the vase. "That was 18th century, she hissed, her voice trembling not with worry, but with a cold, jagged rage. She stepped over my son, ignoring his sobbing, and knelt to touch the jagged remnants of the ceramic. "Look at this," she muttered, not looking at me. "I told you he was a liability. Clumsy, slow, and now he's costing me thousands of dollars. You really should have taught him better, but I suppose it's hard to teach a child who isn't quite all there." The room went silent. The sound of Leo's crying seemed to echo against the high ceilings, vibrating in my chest. My husband, Mark, walked in from the patio just then, beer in hand, his expression shifting from confusion to mild annoyance as he took in the scene. He looked at the broken vase, then at his sister, and finally at me. He didn't rush to his son. He didn't look at Leo's bleeding hand. He looked at Elena and asked, "What happened?" "Your wife let him run wild," Elena said, standing up and brushing invisible dust from her dress, her eyes cold and accusing. "She doesn't discipline him. She treats him like a genius when he's clearly a burden." I told her he wasn't welcome to touch the heirlooms, but some mothers are just too incompetent to listen. I felt a surge of adrenaline so hot it was blinding. I knelt down and gathered Leo into my arms, pressing his face into my shoulder to muffle his cries, feeling his hot tears soak through my sweater. I stood up, staring directly at my husband, waiting for him to defend us, to say something, anything, to correct the vile lie she had just spat out. But Mark stood there, silent, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Mark," I said, my voice barely a whisper, though it felt like a scream. "She called our son a burden. She insulted him to his face. Tell her to apologize. Mark looked at me, his eyes devoid of the warmth I had known for years. It's just a vase, Sarah. Don't make a scene. Just clean it up and apologize to Elena for the mess. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. I looked from my husband's averted eyes to Elena, who was wearing a smug, triumphant smirk. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just being insulted by a woman who hated me. I was being betrayed by the one person who was supposed to be my partner. Clean it up? I repeated, my voice trembling with a rage so pure it felt like liquid fire. She called our son slow. She called him a burden. And your only concern is a piece of painted clay? You're being dramatic, Mark snapped, finally looking at me, his face twisted in annoyance. It was an expensive piece. Can you just take Leo to the car and calm down? We haven't even had lunch yet. I looked down at Leo. He had stopped crying, his eyes wide and fearful, his little hands still throbbing and stained with red. He looked up at me, his bottom lip trembling, and whispered, "Mama, why is Auntie mean to me?" Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the quiet, final sound of a bridge burning. I turned back to Elena, who had crossed her arms, clearly enjoying the spectacle of my failing marriage. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just walked toward the front door, gripping Leo's hand tight enough that I worried I might be hurting him, but I couldn't let go. I had to get out. "We're leaving," I announced, my voice steady, ice cold. "Don't be ridiculous," Mark said, stepping into my path, his hand reaching out to grab my arm. "You are not leaving. We're here for the whole weekend. You are not going to embarrass me in front of my family because you can't handle a little criticism." I pulled away, my eyes locked on his. "You think this is criticism? You think this is an embarrassment? You haven't seen anything yet." I reached the front door and grabbed our bags, throwing them into the hallway with a chaotic crash that mirrored the broken vase. Elena let out a sharp, mocking laugh, but I ignored her. I walked out to the car, buckled Leo into his seat, and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the wheel. I looked toward the porch, expecting Mark to follow, to beg me to stay, to finally realize what he had done. He didn't. He stood in the doorway, talking to Elena, both of them watching me with total indifference. I put the car in reverse, backing down the long gravel driveway, but as I hit the main road, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down. It was a text from Mark. "If you leave now, don't expect me to be there when you get home. We're done." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The world outside the windshield was blurring into streaks of gray and green as I drove, my mind spiraling. I had left the house, left the confrontation, left the life I thought I was building. But as I hit the highway, a notification pinged on my dash, a photo message from a number I didn't recognize. I waited until I pulled into a rest stop, my hands still trembling, to open it. It was a picture of me, taken from inside the house, through the window of the living room. In the photo, I was kneeling, holding Leo, my face twisted in distress. It was time-stamped from 5 minutes ago. There was a message attached. "You think you're running away, Sarah? We've been watching you for a lot longer than today. You have no idea what your husband has already agreed to." My blood ran cold. I sat in the stillness of the car, the engine ticking as it cooled, the silence of the woods surrounding the rest stop feeling suddenly claustrophobic. I looked at the photo again. In the background of the shot, through the reflection of the glass, I could see Mark. He wasn't looking at me or Elena. He was looking at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, looking entirely composed, entirely calculated. I realized then that this hadn't been a spontaneous outburst of cruelty. It was a setup. The insult, the broken vase, the demand for me to stay, everything had been calibrated to force a reaction, to push me to the edge, and I had walked right into the trap. But why? What could they possibly gain from this? I looked at the photo one more time, zooming in on the corner of the frame. There, barely visible on the side table near the window, was a small, black device I hadn't noticed while I was rushing to help Leo. A microphone. I checked my purse, my keys, my wallet, Leo's diaper bag, and then, at the bottom of the bag, tucked deep inside a side pocket I rarely used, I felt something hard and rectangular. I pulled it out. It was a digital voice recorder, its red light blinking in the dim light of the car. It had been recording since we left the house this morning. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned the device over and pressed the playback button, my breath hitching as the sound of my own voice filled the car, followed by voices I didn't recognize. And then, clear as day, I heard Mark's voice, cold and devoid of any emotion, speaking to his sister. "She's almost at the breaking point," Mark said on the recording. "Once she leaves, the narrative is set. She abandons the house, she takes the child against my wishes, and the custody papers I've already prepared become bulletproof. She's going to hand me everything on a silver platter." I sat in the silence, the sound of his betrayal ringing in my ears, when suddenly a heavy thud hit the roof of my car. I jumped, letting out a stifled scream as I looked up. The roof of the car buckled under the weight of something heavy. My breath hitched in my throat as I scrambled to look out the rearview mirror, but the rest stop was empty, only shadows and the swaying of tall, dark pines. I looked at Leo, who had fallen asleep amidst the chaos, his little chest rising and falling in rhythmic peace. I had to get him safe. I had to get out of there. I slammed the car into drive, tires screeching against the asphalt as I peeled out of the rest stop, leaving a trail of gravel behind me. My heart was a frantic drum, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Whoever, or whatever, had been on the roof was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained, heavy and suffocating. I hit the highway, accelerating until the speedometer pushed past the limit, my mind racing faster than the car. Mark wasn't just a cold husband. He was a predator, and I had been living in his cage for years without ever realizing the bars were closing in. The custody papers, the setup, the recording, everything had been perfectly choreographed to destroy me. But he had made one mistake. He had underestimated how far I would go to protect my son. I reached for my phone, intent on calling my brother, my mother, anyone who could help. But the screen went dead, black, a forced restart. I pounded the steering wheel, my frustration boiling over, until the screen flickered back to life. A single notification appeared, bypassing my lock screen. It wasn't from Mark. It was from a private number. "Turn off the main road. The police are waiting for you at the next exit, but they aren't looking for help. They're looking for a kidnapped child." My blood turned to ice. I looked up at the road signs. The next exit was less than a mile away, and sure enough, I saw the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the overhead gantries. They were waiting. My husband had called the police, painting me as the aggressor, as the unstable mother running away with a child who